Welcome back to Echoes of Ihsan, everyone. Today we're going on a really fascinating deep dive. We're going to be looking at the Muwatta Imam Malik, specifically Book 18, all about fasting.
Ah, yes. The Muwatta, it's so important. It's one of the earliest collections we have of hadith.
It's really incredible to be able to look back at these early scholarships, really get a glimpse into how the companions of the Prophet were understanding and living Islam. And in this case, we're talking about fasting, something that every Muslim around the world is very familiar with, especially during the month of Ramadan.
Exactly. And Book 18 of the Muwatta goes into a lot of detail. It covers all sorts of things, like how do we know when Ramadan starts? Or what are the rules about breaking the fast? Or even things like, what about voluntary fasts? Or if you miss a fast, how do you make it up? It really covers a lot.
It's amazing how comprehensive this book is, like a guide for all these important questions. So let's jump in. Let's start with something very basic. We know that the Islamic calendar is a lunar calendar.
Mm.
So how do we figure out when Ramadan begins and ends?
Well, it's interesting. The Muwatta relies on a bunch of different narrations, and what they emphasize is that we have to actually see the new moon, to physically see it. It's not about using some kind of calculations or charts or anything like that.
So we actually have to look to the sky to see it with our own eyes. I mean, that's pretty profound in a way.
It really is. It's kind of beautiful, right? It reminds us that the natural world and the signs that God has given us in creation guide us in our worship.
I love that. It really grounds us in something bigger than ourselves. But you know what I'm wondering about? What if we can't see the moon? Like, what if there are clouds or something else in the way? What do we do then?
Well, the Muwatta talks about that too. They have this idea of working it out, which basically means that we use what we already know about the moon and when it should appear. We look back at previous sightings and the patterns we've observed.
So we kind of use our knowledge of the lunar cycle to help us make a good judgment when we can't see the moon directly.
Exactly. Which, I think it's an important point because it shows that Islamic jurisprudence isn't just a set of rigid rules. It takes into account the reality of our world.
That's a really good point. But doesn't this mean that there could be some variation in when Ramadan starts? Like maybe some people see it and others don't?
That's where the idea of communal validation is so important. It can't just be one person seeing the moon. It needs to be multiple witnesses, and they need to come forward to confirm it.
So it's like a system of checks and balances to make sure everyone is on the same page.
Exactly. It creates a sense of unity and purpose, which is really important during Ramadan.
So what happens if someone gets it wrong? Let's say they think they saw the moon, but they're wrong. Do they have to make up that fast?
Well, there's a really interesting story in the Muwatta about this. It happened during the time of Uthman ibn Affan, one of the early caliphs.
Oh, I know who you're talking about. The third caliph.
That's right. So the story goes that the new moon was sighted in the afternoon, but Uthman waited until sunset to break his fast because he wanted to follow the proper procedures and make sure the whole community was together.
Wow, that's a powerful reminder that we need to follow established practices and rely on the guidance of those who know.
It really shows the value of communal wisdom and the importance of working together as a community.
Okay, so we've talked about how to know when Ramadan starts, the importance of seeing the moon, and making sure the community is all on the same page. But what about the inner part of fasting? Is it just about not eating and drinking, or is there more to it?
You've hit on something really important. The Muwatta makes it clear that intention is absolutely essential for fasting. Abdullah ibn Umar, one of the companions of the Prophet, said, "The one who doesn't make the intention to fast before dawn, their fast is not valid."
Wow. Intention. So it's not just what we do on the outside, but also what's happening in our hearts.
Yes. Intention is what makes our fasting meaningful. It transforms it from just a physical act to an act of worship. It's about making a conscious choice to abstain from things for the sake of God.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the difference between just not eating because you're not hungry versus choosing not to eat for a spiritual purpose.
Exactly. The Muwatta reminds us that fasting is not just an empty ritual, it's about mindfulness. It's about connecting to God, and it's about growing spiritually.
This is giving me a whole new understanding of fasting, so much deeper than I realized. It's not just about what we do, it's about who we are on the inside.
And that inner state, that intention, that's what truly matters. That's what elevates the act of fasting and makes it something special.
Okay, so we've covered the beginning of the fast and the importance of intention. What about when it's time to break the fast? Is there anything in the Muwatta about that?
There is. The Muwatta actually encourages us to break the fast as soon as possible when the time comes. There's a hadith where the Prophet said, "The people will continue to prosper as long as they hasten to break the fast."
Now that's interesting. Why the rush? I mean, After a whole day of fasting, you'd think we'd want to take our time.
I know it might seem counterintuitive, but there's a deep wisdom behind it. It's about being grateful, realizing that we're blessed to have food and drink, and embracing the chance to nourish ourselves after abstaining.
So it's about recognizing those blessings and not taking them for granted.
Absolutely. And there's also an element of humility involved. We're acknowledging that we rely on God for our sustenance, and that the ability to break our fast is a gift from Him.
I love that perspective. It's not about just indulging ourselves, but about approaching it with mindfulness and appreciation. Is there anything in the Muwatta that illustrates this sense of eagerness to break the fast?
There's a really nice narration about Umar ibn al-Khattab and Uthman ibn Affan.
Oh, wow. Two of the most important figures in early Islam.
Exactly. And the story says that they would pray Maghrib, the sunset prayer, as soon as it got dark enough, even before breaking their fast.
So they were so excited to break their fast that they didn't even wait to pray first.
They were eager to experience those blessings and partake in what God had provided for them.
It's amazing to see these stories and how they reflect such deep values and principles. Okay, I'm really starting to see how the Muwatta addresses so many different aspects of fasting and provides such insightful guidance. Now, I'm curious about what it says about Janaba.
Ah, yes. The state of ritual impurity after intimacy.
Exactly. It's a topic that a lot of people have questions about, especially when it comes to fasting.
For sure. And the Muwatta offers some very clear guidance on this. There are actually a few narrations that address it directly, and they help to dispel some common misconceptions.
What does it say? Does being in a state of Janaba when you wake up mean your fast is invalid?
Not at all. There's a hadith where a man asked the Prophet about this very thing, and the Prophet said, I experienced the same thing, and I perform ghusl and fast.
Ghusl being the ritual bath.
That's right. So the Prophet himself confirms that it's okay to fast even if you were in a state of janaba at dawn, as long as you perform ghusl.
Okay, that definitely clears up a lot of confusion. I'm glad to see that the Muwatta tackles these kinds of questions head on.
Absolutely. It's all about providing clear guidance based on the authentic teachings of the Prophet and his companions. And in fact, there are narrations from Aisha and Salama, two of the Prophet's wives, where they also emphasize this ruling. And they even corrected some misinformation that was going around at the time.
It's so empowering to see these women taking such an active role in explaining and clarifying these practices. Now, thinking about this topic, I'm sure a lot of people also have questions about intimacy and physical affection while fasting. Does the Muwatta go into that?
It does. There are actually quite a few narrations about things like kissing and touching during fasting. And while there are some different opinions and practices, the main idea is that we need to exercise self-control and be mindful of our own weaknesses.
Can you say more about those different opinions? Like, what are some of the things that people had different views on?
Well, for example, Aisha, the Prophet's wife, mentioned that the Prophet would kiss his wives while fasting.
Okay, so that suggests that some expressions of affection are allowed.
Right. But she also talked about how the Prophet had exceptional self-control. So the idea is that we need to be aware of our own limitations and avoid anything that could lead to breaking our fast.
So it's about finding a balance between expressing love and affection and also respecting the boundaries of the fast.
Exactly. And, there's another narration where Abdullah ibn Abbas, a very respected companion, he said that it was okay for older men to kiss, but he advised younger men not to.
That makes sense. I mean, younger people might have a harder time controlling their desires.
Right. So it's about being honest with ourselves and knowing what we can handle.
What about if someone is traveling during Ramadan? We know that traveling allows you to break your fast. Does the Muwatta talk about intimacy in those situations?
Yes, it does. The Muwatta specifically says that it's okay to be intimate with your spouse when you return from a journey during Ramadan, as long as neither of you is fasting at that time.
It's interesting how Islam takes these very real-life situations into account.
Absolutely. Islamic law is designed to be practical and flexible, while still upholding the core principles of the faith.
It's really inspiring to see that kind of compassion and understanding woven into the very fabric of Islamic teachings. It really emphasizes that it's not about blindly following rules, but about finding a path that works for you while still honoring your obligations.
Well said. It's all about finding that balance between adherence and individual needs. Which brings us to another topic that really demonstrates this flexibility: fasting while traveling.
Yes, let's talk about that. It's something that a lot of Muslims have questions about,
Hmm.
especially with how much people travel nowadays.
It's an important topic for sure. And the Muwatta actually offers quite a few narrations that show how much flexibility Islam allows when it comes to fasting and traveling.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, there's one where the Prophet was traveling to Makkah during Ramadan, and he was fasting until he reached a place called Al-Qadid, and then he decided to break his fast, and his companions did the same.
So he chose not to fast while he was traveling.
Yes, which shows us that it's permissible to break the fast when you're on a journey. But there's also another narration that's really interesting. In this one, the Prophet encourages his companions to fast while traveling. He said it would give them strength against their enemies.
So he was telling them to fast for strength, but he himself chose to break his fast.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is that he was continuing to fast, even though it was so hot that he was pouring water over his head.
So he was pushing himself while also recognizing that his companions might need to make a different choice.
That's right. He wasn't forcing them to do what he was doing. He was emphasizing that it's about choosing what's best for you in that moment.
That's a really powerful lesson. It's about understanding our own needs and making informed decisions.
And the Muwatta actually goes even further in supporting this idea of individual choice. There's a narration from Anas ibn Malik, a companion of the Prophet, and he said that during a journey in Ramadan, the people who were fasting didn't criticize the people who weren't fasting, and vice versa.
So there was a sense of mutual respect for each other's choices.
Exactly. And it really goes back to that famous hadith, religion is ease. It's not meant to be burdensome or difficult.
This is really eye-opening. It's changing the way I think about fasting while traveling. Now, I have a question. What if someone breaks their fast during Ramadan on purpose, and they don't have a good reason, like traveling or being sick? Are there consequences for that?
Yes, there are. That brings us to the concept of kafara, which is a way of making amends for breaking the fast without a valid reason. And the Muwatta has a whole section devoted to this, with examples and explanations.
Can you explain what kafara is? I've heard the term, but I'm not sure I fully understand it.
So basically, it's a way of atoning for breaking a religious obligation. In this case, intentionally breaking the fast during Ramadan. And the Muwatta outlines several different options for how to fulfill this obligation.
Like, what are some of the options?
Well, the first option, as narrated by Abu Hurairah, one of the Prophet's close companions, is to free a slave.
Wow, that's a big one.
It is, and it shows how seriously Islam takes the idea of freedom. Taking away someone's freedom is a grave offense.
What if someone can't afford to free a slave?
The Muwatta offers alternatives for those situations. Another option is to fast for 2 months straight.
Oh, wow, that's a long time.
It is a serious commitment. And if someone can't do that either, maybe because of health reasons, there's a third option, feeding 60 poor people.
So there are different ways to make amends, depending on what someone's circumstances are.
Exactly. And it's interesting how each of those options reflects a different value: freedom, commitment, compassion.
That's a really good point. I'm remembering a story from the Muwatta about a man who couldn't do any of those options.
Oh, yes. The man who broke his fast and didn't have the means to fulfill any of the kafara options.
What happened to him? I can't remember.
He went to the Prophet feeling really distressed, and the Prophet in his kindness gave him a big basket of dates and told him to give them away as charity.
That was so generous of the Prophet.
It was, but then the man said he was the most needy person there.
Oh, wow. What did the Prophet do?
He laughed and told the man to eat the dates himself.
That is such a beautiful story. It really shows the compassion at the heart of Islam.
It does. It shows that Islam is about understanding and meeting people where they are.
This is really incredible. The Muwatta is full of so much wisdom and practical guidance. Okay, so let's move on to another topic. What about cupping? You know, hijama.
Ah, yes, cupping. The Muwatta actually talks about that too. And like with some other topics, there are a few different opinions presented.
Really? Like what? Does cupping break the fast?
Well, some companions of the Prophet, like Abdullah ibn Umar and Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, they did cupping while they were fasting. But there's also a bit of caution in the Muwatta. Some people were worried that cupping might weaken a person who's fasting and maybe make it too hard for them to continue.
So it's about being careful and using common sense.
Exactly. The most important thing is to protect the integrity of the fast. If cupping might make it too hard to fast, then it's better to avoid it.
I see. It's about making wise choices that are in line with the spirit of the fast. The Muwatta seems to encourage us to be thoughtful and considerate of our own needs.
That's a great observation. It's not about blindly following rules. It's about understanding the principles behind them and applying them in a way that makes sense.
Okay, so we've talked about cupping. Let's move on to another topic that's really interesting, Ashura, the 10th of Muharram.
Ah, yes, Ashura. It has so much significance in Islamic history.
It does, but I've always been a little confused about how it relates to fasting.
Well, the Muwatta actually tells us a lot about that. It explains how Ashura was observed before Islam and how things changed after the Prophet received revelation.
So people were fasting on Ashura even before Islam.
Yes, Aisha, the Prophet's wife, said that the Quraysh tribe, which was the Prophet's tribe, they used to fast on Ashura even in the pre-Islamic period.
Wow, so it was already a tradition.
It was. And the Prophet himself continued fasting on Ashura even after he migrated to Medina.
So what changed?
When Ramadan was revealed as a month of fasting, the obligation to fast on Ashura was lifted. It became a recommended practice, but it was no longer required.
So Ramadan became the main focus for fasting, but Ashura still holds a special place.
Exactly. And there's a narration in the Muwatta where Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, he was a companion of the Prophet, he addressed the people of Medina and made it clear that while he was fasting on Ashura, it wasn't an obligation for them.
So it became a matter of choice.
That's right. It's fascinating to see how Islamic practices evolved over time as new revelations came.
I'm learning so much about Ashura. It's amazing how much history and depth there is to it. Now, I know that there are some days when fasting is actually forbidden. Can you talk about those?
Of course. The Muwatta very clearly states that we are not allowed to fast on two major Islamic holidays. Eid al-Fitr, which comes at the end of Ramadan, and Eid al-Adha, the festival of sacrifice. And fasting is also forbidden on the days of Tashriq, which are the 11th, 12th, and 13th days of Dhul Hijjah, the month of pilgrimage.
So those are days for celebrating and giving thanks.
Exactly. They're about feasting, spending time with family and friends, and remembering God's blessings. Fasting, which is all about abstaining, doesn't really fit with the spirit of those celebrations.
That makes perfect sense. And what about the days of Tashriq? Why are those days off limits?
Those days are specifically for the Hajj pilgrimage, and during those days, the pilgrims are doing a lot of rituals that require physical strength and energy. Fasting would make it really difficult for them to fulfill those obligations, and could even be harmful.
It's incredible how Islamic teachings take into account both the spiritual and physical needs of people.
Well said. It's about finding that balance and recognizing that Islam is not meant to cause harm or hardship.
This has been such an amazing exploration of the Muwatta and its teachings on fasting. It's truly inspiring to see how much wisdom and flexibility there is in Islamic law.
The Muwatta is a remarkable book. It's full of guidance that is as relevant today as it was centuries ago.
I'm feeling so much more informed and connected to my faith after this deep dive.
I'm delighted to hear that. It's always rewarding to explore these timeless teachings and see how they resonate with people.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the basics of fasting, like how to know when Ramadan starts and the importance of having the right intention. And we even touched on the flexibility that Islam offers, like breaking your fast while traveling. But now I want to get into some of the more specific practices and rulings that the Muwatta talks about. One thing I've always been curious about is continuous fasting. They call wizal.
Ah, yes, Wizal. Fasting for many days without a break. It's something that people have a lot of questions about, and sometimes there are misunderstandings, but the Muwatta actually gives us some really valuable insights, especially when it comes to the Prophet Muhammad's own practice.
I know what you mean. I've heard that the Prophet himself did wizal, but I've also heard that he told other people not to do it. Seems kind of contradictory.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? But the Muwatta makes it clear that while the Prophet did practice Wizal, he also discouraged others from doing it. And that distinction is really important. It helps us to understand the guidance that the Muwatta is offering.
So how do we make sense of those two things? The Prophet doing it, but also saying not to do it.
The key is to remember that the Prophet was a very special person, and he had abilities that ordinary people don't have. The Muwatta actually explains that the Prophet was able to fast for long periods because God was giving him a special kind of sustenance. There's a narration where he says, "My Lord feeds me and gives me to drink." So he wasn't experiencing the same kind of difficulty that others would.
So it was like a miracle or a special blessing that he had.
Exactly. And that's why he told other people not to try to imitate him. He knew that it could be too hard for them and could even harm their health.
That's a good reminder that we can't always do what the Prophet did. We need to know our own limits.
Yes. The Muwatta is guiding us to find inspiration from the Prophet's example, but also to be realistic about our own capacities.
This is making me think about everything in a new light. It's really important to have that balance. Now I'm thinking about people who are fasting to make up for missed fasts. Like if they miss some days during Ramadan. What happens if they get sick or something makes it really hard for them to fast? Does the Muwatta talk about that?
It does. And as always, the Muwatta is full of compassion and understanding. It recognizes that sometimes things happen that make it hard to fast, even if you're trying to make up for missed days. And it offers rulings to help people in those situations.
Can you give us some examples? Like what does the Muwatta advise people to do?
Sure. So let's say someone is fasting to make up for a missed Ramadan fast, and then they get sick. The Muwatta says it's okay for them to break their fast and make it up later when they're feeling better. And the same goes for women who are fasting to make up for missed days, and then they start their period. They can stop fasting and continue later when their period is over.
That's really reassuring.
Yeah.
It shows that Islam is not about being rigid. It's about recognizing that people have real-life challenges.
Exactly. And it reflects this beautiful verse from the Quran that says, God intends for you ease and does not intend for you hardship. This idea of ease and compassion runs throughout Islamic teachings.
It's so nice to see how these rulings reflect the core values of Islam. Okay, so we've talked about what to do if you get sick while making up fasts. What about sick people in general? Does the Muwatta have anything to say about whether sick people are allowed to break their fast? Even if it's not for making up missed days.
Yes, it does. And the Muwatta is very clear that if someone is sick and fasting is making them feel worse, they're allowed to break their fast. It doesn't matter how serious the illness is. The point is that if fasting is causing hardship, then it's okay to stop.
So it's not about waiting until you're almost dying. It's about recognizing that any illness can make fasting difficult.
Right. The Muwatta even compares it to praying. If someone is sick and can't stand up to pray, they're allowed to pray sitting down. And in the same way, if someone is sick and fasting is too hard, they can break their fast.
It's such a clear and simple analogy. It's about putting our well-being first.
Exactly. God understands our limitations, and He doesn't want us to push ourselves beyond what we can handle.
This is making me think about how important it is to be kind to ourselves and not feel guilty if we need to break our fast for a good reason. Okay, I have a question about something I've always wondered about. Is it allowed to fast on behalf of someone else? Like if someone has passed away, can you fast for them?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one that comes up a lot. So the Muwatta addresses this through a narration from Abdullah ibn Umar. He was a companion of the Prophet who is known for following the Prophet's teachings very carefully, and he was asked if someone could fast or pray on behalf of someone else. And he said very clearly, no one can fast or do the prayer for anyone else.
So the idea of fasting for someone else, whether they're alive or dead, is not supported by the Muwatta.
That's right. This narration suggests that each person is responsible for their own actions and their own worship. It's a very personal and individual thing.
I see. So everyone will be judged based on their own deeds. You can't transfer your good deeds to someone else or take on their burdens.
Exactly. It emphasizes the importance of personal accountability in Islam.
Okay, that's a really helpful clarification. Thanks for explaining that. Now let's talk about something a bit more practical. Making up missed fasts. I know a lot of people have questions about how to do that correctly. Does the Muwatta give us any specific guidance?
It does. There's a whole section on making up missed fasts, and it covers a lot of different situations and rulings.
What are some of the key things it talks about?
One of the most important things is that if you break your fast during Ramadan for a valid reason, like being sick or traveling, you should make up those missed days all at once, one day after another, without any breaks.
So you're supposed to do them consecutively.
That's right. That's the preferred way to do it. According to Abdullah ibn Umar, who, as we know, was very meticulous about following the Prophet's practices, but the Muwatta also recognizes that not everyone agreed on this.
Oh, really? What were some of the other opinions?
Well, Ibn Shihab, a very famous scholar, he said that there was a difference of opinion between Abdullah ibn Abbas and Abu Huraira. They were both close companions of the Prophet. And one of them said you should do the make-up fasts all at once, and the other one said it was okay to do them separately.
So there's some flexibility allowed.
Yes, there is. Imam Malik, who compiled the Muwatta, he said that if someone does their make-up fasts separately, they don't have to do them again. But he also said that it's better to do them all at once, following the opinion of Abdullah ibn Umar.
It's good to know that there's some leeway, that Islam recognizes that people have different situations.
Absolutely. Islamic law tries to find a balance between upholding the principles and being considerate of individual needs.
What other things does the Muwatta talk about when it comes to making up fasts? Like, what if you break your fast by accident? Or when are you supposed to make up the fasts?
It talks about all of that. For example, it says that if you accidentally eat or drink something while you're fasting, whether it's during Ramadan or any other time, you have to make up that day.
So you have to take responsibility for your actions, even if it was an honest mistake.
That's right. It's about recognizing the importance of the fast and making things right.
What about the timing? Does the Muwatta say when you have to make up the fasts by?
It doesn't give a specific deadline, but it does say that it's best to do it as soon as possible. Aisha, the Prophet's wife, she said that sometimes she would wait to make up her missed Ramadan fasts until Shaban, the month before Ramadan. But that was more of an exception. It's generally recommended to make them up sooner rather than later.
So don't procrastinate.
Right. Show that you're serious about fulfilling your obligations.
Now, what about people who convert to Islam right before Ramadan? Do they have to make up all the fasts they missed in previous years, even though they weren't Muslim then?
That's a great question, and the Muwatta is very clear on that. It says that people who convert to Islam close to Ramadan do not have to make up any of the days they missed before becoming Muslim. Their obligation to fast starts from the day they embraced Islam.
Wow, that's really kind. It recognizes that they weren't required to fast before.
It's about making it easy for people to come into Islam without feeling overwhelmed.
I'm really seeing how adaptable Islamic law is. It takes into account so many different situations.
That's the beauty of it. It's about guiding people to fulfill their obligations in a way that makes sense for them.
Okay, we've covered a lot about making up missed fasts. Now I want to switch gears and talk about voluntary fasts. Like if you decide to fast on a day that's not Ramadan, what happens if you start a voluntary fast and then you need to break it? Do you have to make it up? Is it the same as with an obligatory fast?
That's a good question. And the answer is actually no. There's a difference between voluntary and obligatory fasts in that regard.
Can you explain the difference?
So the Muwatta says that if you break a voluntary fast for a valid reason, you don't have to make it up. Because the whole point of a voluntary fast is to get closer to God and to earn extra rewards. So if something comes up and you need to break the fast, it's not a sin, and you don't have to make it up.
It's more about the intention behind it than anything else.
Exactly. And there's a story in the Muwatta about Aisha and Hafsa, two of the Prophet's wives. They were doing a voluntary fast, and then someone offered them food, so they broke their fast. And when the Prophet found out, he just told them to fast another day instead.
So he wasn't upset with them. He just told them to make it up later.
Right. He understood that their intention was good.
That's a good reminder that it's okay to be flexible with voluntary fasts.
It is. Islam is about being kind to ourselves and recognizing that sometimes things happen.
Okay, now what about people who can't fast at all? Like older people or people who have chronic illnesses, do they have to fast?
That's a really important question. And the Muwatta addresses this through the concept of fidya.
Can you explain what figure is?
Fidya is a way for people who can't fast because of old age or illness to still fulfill the obligation of fasting. It's a kind of compensation.
So instead of fasting, they do something else.
Right. They make a charitable donation for each day that they can't fast. And that donation usually goes to help the poor and needy, especially during Ramadan.
That's a beautiful way to participate in the spirit of Ramadan, even if you can't physically fast.
It is. It shows that Islam is about taking care of each other and making sure that everyone can be included.
So who exactly is eligible to give fidya? Does the Muwatta give any specific examples?
Well, it mentions that Anas ibn Malik, a companion of the Prophet, he used to give fidya when he got too old to fast. And Abdullah ibn Umar, another companion, he said that pregnant and breastfeeding women who found fasting difficult should break their fast and give fidya.
It's so considerate of the needs of mothers and their babies.
Islam prioritizes health and well-being, and it recognizes that sometimes we need to make choices that are in line with those priorities.
Is there a specific amount of fidya that you have to give?
The Muwatta says that you should give 1 mud of food for each day that you miss. A mud is an old measurement. It's basically a handful or two of food. So it's a decent amount, enough to actually make a difference for someone who's hungry.
It's not just a symbolic gesture.
Right. And the Muwatta also adds that if you wait to make up your missed Ramadan fast until the next Ramadan comes around, even though you could have done it sooner, then you have to give fidya on top of making up the fasts.
So there's an extra consequence for putting it off.
It encourages people to fulfill their obligations in a timely manner.
This deep dive into the Muwatta has been so eye-opening. I'm really impressed by how Islam addresses all these different situations with both practicality and sensitivity.
The Muwatta is a testament to the richness and wisdom of Islamic tradition, and its teachings on fasting are truly timeless.
I'm feeling so much more informed and inspired after this conversation.
I'm so glad to hear that. It's always a joy to explore these teachings and see how they can benefit people today.
It's amazing to me how the Muwatta manages to cover both the practical side of things and the deeper spiritual meaning of fasting. It's not just a book of rules. It's like a guide to living a more fulfilling and connected life.
That's a great way to put it. It reminds us that fasting is about so much more than just the physical act of abstaining. It's about what's happening inside of us, the purification of our hearts and minds.
This whole deep dive has been such a rewarding experience. I feel like I've learned so much and gained a whole new appreciation for the wisdom of Islamic teachings on fasting.
I'm so happy to hear that. It's always a privilege to explore these teachings and see how they can impact people's lives.
Before we wrap up our exploration of the Muwatta, is there anything else that you think is important for our listeners to know? Any last bits of wisdom that we haven't covered yet?
There's one thing that I found particularly interesting, especially since people often have a lot of questions about what you can and can't do while fasting. The Muwatta mentions that using a miswak is perfectly fine at any time during Ramadan.
Oh, that's interesting. Miswak. The little stick people use to clean their teeth.
Yes, it's a natural way to clean your teeth and freshen your breath. And the Muwatta says it's okay to use it even while you're fasting.
So it doesn't break the fast.
Nope. It's considered a normal part of hygiene.
That's really helpful to know. I bet a lot of our listeners will be glad to hear that. It's a good example of how Islamic teachings really consider the details of our lives.
It shows that it's not about making things unnecessarily difficult. It's about finding a balance.
This has been such a fascinating and insightful conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I feel like I've learned so much about the Muwatta and its teachings on fasting.
The pleasure was all mine. It's always a joy to discuss these topics and see how they can benefit people.
To our listeners, I encourage you to really think about what we've talked about today. How can you use these teachings from the Muwatta to deepen your understanding of fasting? Not just during Ramadan, but all year round. Remember the key takeaways, the importance of intention, self-control, and constantly seeking knowledge. These are all essential parts of making our fasting meaningful and transformative.
Fasting is such a powerful act of worship. It has the potential to uplift us spiritually and draw us closer to God. It's a journey of self-discovery. It's a reminder of our dependence on our Creator. And it's a chance to develop compassion for those who are less fortunate.
And as we end this episode, I want to leave you with a question to reflect on. We've talked about the physical aspect of fasting, abstaining from food and drink. But what about the deeper transformation that fasting can bring about? How can you use the power of fasting to become a better version of yourself? Not just during Ramadan, but in every aspect of your life. We invite you to share your thoughts and continue the conversation with us on our Echoes of Ihsan social media platforms. Until next time, may peace and blessings be upon you all.